Today we're going to talk about Cardinal Sarah. So he, one of the great cardinals, he's a very faithful son of the church. He's from Guinea, Africa. I'm reading currently his book, God or Nothing. So it is really, actually, it's very touching. I will be doing a full review on the book when I'm done. So he was in May 25th. He's the head of the congregation for discipline of the Sacraments and the liturgy and so forth. But who knows how long he's going to last in Rome these days, because he's not a very innovative, novelty-driven kind of a person. He is a Catholic. He holds on to the faith which he has received. So anyways, so he visited Notre Dame de Paris, the Notre Dame parish in the cathedral after it burned, and on May 25th, and he did a lecture in Paris after he visited the cathedral at the Saint-François-Xavier Church. Before we go into this, actually I'll just go ahead right away. I was gonna show you some other things, but so he has his book, which is coming. It will be published in September. It's called The Evening is Fast Approaching and the Day is Already Far Spent. And this comes actually from Scripture. So in this lecture, he talks about a lot of things. Almost every single word is precious in this thing. Let me kind of go over some of it. So it was done on May 25th, 2019. So he says, I must present you my last book, which will be published in English, September 2019. And of course I will review as soon as I get it. So The Evening is Fast, is approaching, and already the day is falling. Of course, that's the Google Translate of this French article. So in it, he says, I analyze the deep crisis in the West. Crisis of faith, crisis of the church, crisis of priests, crisis of identity, crisis of meaning of man and human life, spiritual collapse and its consequences. So he says, he was in Notre Dame and looking at all this devastated church, this disemboweled church, its guts has been taken out, this disemboweled church, contemplating its collapsed vaults. I could not, that's what Cardinal Sarah is saying, I could not help seeing it as a symbol of the situation of Western civilization and of the church in Europe. Church in America, the church in most of the world almost, except maybe for the Middle East, where there is persecution, there is flourishing as well. So anyways, he says, yes, today on all sides, the church seems to be on fire. It seems to be ravaged by a fire much more destructive than that of Notre Dame Cathedral. And what's this fire? He says this fire is doctrinal and moral confusion. It is the cowardice to proclaim the truth about God and man, and to defend and transmit moral values and Christian ethics of Christian tradition. It is the loss of faith, the spirit of faith, the loss of the sense of the objectivity of faith, and thus the loss of the sense of God. And I have to skip some of it. It's a really long speech. So he says, the unique reason, the unique raison d'être, like the reason for being of the church, what is it? It's to lead us to God, to orient ourselves to Him. Let's see if I can use this here. To lead us to God, to orient us. Where are we here? So a church that does not orient towards God is a church that dies and collapses. So he says, I'm convinced that this civilization is living a deadly crisis. And he says, as a bishop, here we go, as a bishop, I must warn the West. The fire of barbarism threatens you. And what is this barbarism? A lot of things. For example, he says, the lure of money that liberalism spreads in one's hearts makes the people sleepy. Meanwhile, the silent tragedy of abortion and euthanasia continues, while pornography and gender ideology mutilate and destroy children and adolescents. So, Western civilization is in deep decay and ruin. Despite the fantastic scientific and technological success and appearances of prosperity. So Western civilization, he says, it's lost because it lost its meaning of existence, which is to show God and lead us to God. A West that denies its faith, its history, its Christian roots is condemned to contempt and death. So he says basically, the modern rejection of God locks us into a new totalitarianism, that of relativism, which admits of no law except that of prophets. And of course, he's clear that there's this idea that, okay, we can separate, be secular and be in the middle, ignoring God in our lives, but that's not possible. He says, the nature of socialism is exposed and unmasked. Its last limits are manifest. Likewise, the fact that irreligion and religious neutrality do not exist. That the religion of the living God is opposed to the religion of the devil. The religion of Christ is opposed to the religion of Antichrist. I'm just going to skip a bunch here. So basically as well, he says, God has to be in every aspect of society, in our lives, here, in our culture, in public discourse. He cannot be isolated. Because otherwise we condemn man to solitude. So he says here, the spiritual crisis that I describe concerns the whole world. So it isn't just Europe, but its source is in Europe. The rejection of God is born of Western consciousness. Now, and he says, people in the West refuse to receive things, like they consider it to be below them to receive something. But in actual fact, receiving, being an inheritor, is a great treasure. It is how civilized man lives. He says, basically you have to receive your inheritance. Without inheritance, you are nothing. And as well, he says, we receive from God our nature as man and woman. So, and that's the problem. And this normal, natural thing, now this becomes unbearable to modern minds. The ideology of gender is thus a refusal to receive from God a sexual nature, which is you look down and you know exactly what you are. That's who you are. And you have to conform to reality. You cannot be something and claim yourself something else. This is called a mental illness. Some in the West go so far as to rebel, and fight against God. So, and the West refuses to receive. It only accepts what it builds itself. Transhumanism, which is another modern thing happening, is the ultimate avatar of this movement. Even human nature, because it's a gift of God, becomes unbearable to the man of the West. This revolt is spiritual in essence. So this is a revolt which Satan against the gift of grace. This is a good one too here. It says, I believe that the great cathedrals of the West could only be built by men of great faith and humility who were deeply happy to know that they were the sons of God. These masterpieces were to glorify and praise God only. Western man is too sad to realize such masterpieces. In the same way, some look at the Catholic Church and say, this church had its day. It's time to change it, make it a new church in our image. So priestly celibacy seems too difficult. Let's make it optional. Moral teaching of the church, of the gospel is too demanding. Let's dilute it with relativism and laxity. Catholic doctrine goes bad in the media. Let's change it. So the church has interest only because it allows us to meet Jesus. It is useful only because it is the door that leads us to the intimate reality of the mystery, that allows us to look at God with eyes in the eye, so face to face. And the point of it is to transmit to us revelation. I'm sorry, I have to kind of skip a bunch here. The loss of the sense of the worship of God is the matrix. Of all the fires and crises that are shaking the world and the church today. We lack worshipers. So what do? He says, get on your knees. He says, go on your knees. The man who is humble, and the humble man, the great man is humble, and the humble man is on his knees. This is a good one too. If no one comes and to prostrate themselves on their knees before God, it no longer makes sense if the liturgy is celebrated there is not entirely directing us to God, to His cross. That's why traditional liturgy is important. It is facing God. It is all towards God. It's not man-centered. It's God-centered. My dear friends, I'm convinced at the heart of the crisis in the church, there is a priestly crisis, a crisis of priest. If the cathedral collapses, it's because the priestly identity collapsed first. Priests were removed from their identity. And he says a priest isn't just like another Christ because he received the character, the mark of priesthood on him, sharing in the high priesthood of Melchizedek. But he is Christ because when he consecrates the bread and wine, he uses the name of Christ. This is my body. This is my blood. He becomes Christ, not just an image of him. And he has to live up to that designation. And he says we should thank our priests not for what they do, but for who they are. Let's see here. And he says he's dedicating this book to the priests around the world because he knows their sufferings. Here we go. This is a good one too. The place of a priest is on the cross. When he celebrates Mass, he is at the source of all his life. That is, at the cross. Celibacy is one of the concrete ways that allows us to live this mystery of the cross in our lives. Celibacy inscribes the cross into our flesh. That's why celibacy is unbearable to the modern world. Priestly celibacy is a scandal to the moderns because the cross is a scandal. All right, let's see here. I often hear, because that's what's coming up in the Amazon Synod. He says, I often hear that celibacy of priests is only a matter of historical discipline. I firmly believe that it is wrong. Actually, it is. It is an apostolic tradition. The churches in the East in the 7th century deviated from this apostolic tradition, allowing the exercise of the marital rights for priests. So anyways, we're not going to delve into that at the moment. As we said above, celibacy reveals the very essence of the Christian priesthood. That is to say, the perfect configuration, the total identification of the priest with Christ, high priest of the new covenant and the goods to come. Okay, here we go again. And dear friends, what is still needed at our cathedral? He's imaging the church as a cathedral. We will need strong pillars to carry its vaults. What are these pillars? On what basis do we support this graceful slenderness of Gothic ribs? I believe it can be said that the Catholic doctrine received from the apostles is the only solid foundation possible. If anyone defends his opinion, his theological assumptions, his novelty, or a pastoral approach that contradicts the requirements of the gospel and the lasting magisterium of the church, then division will spread everywhere. I am horrified that so many pastors sell Catholic doctrine and install division among the faithful. We owe to the Christian people clear, firm, and stable teaching. Because God is not a deceiver here. He tells us the truth. The unity of the faith presupposes a unity of the magisterium in space and time. So it's not like, today we'll teach this, 1,000 years ago they taught that. No, this teaching is consistent throughout time. Those who loudly announce change and rupture are false prophets. They do not seek the good of the flock. They are mercenaries smuggled in the sheepfold. Our unity is forged around truth and Catholic doctrine and moral teaching of the Church. There is no other way. Wanting media popularity at the price of truth is like doing the work of Judas. And we have plenty of Judases running around in the church these days and on the internet, even supported by many bishops, unfortunately. Let us turn to the world and bring the light, the only light that does not deceive, which is the church. If for the church to turn to the world meant to turn away from the cross, it would lead her not to a renewal, but to death. There are so many, this is a good one too, there are so many Christians, there is in many Christians a fear and reluctance to witness to the faith, or to bring to the world the light of the gospel. Our faith has become lukewarm. And Jesus said, if your faith is lukewarm, I will throw you up. I will vomit you out, in the book of Apocalypse, Revelations. Like a memory fading away, it becomes like a cold fog. So we do not dare to affirm that she is, the church, the only light in the world. Yet we have to witness, not of ourselves, but of God, who came to meet us and revealed himself in Jesus Christ, true God and true man. Therefore, he urgently insists on the teaching of catechism to adults and children. So that is and of course, a good, solid catechism. He recommends the Catechism of the Catholic Church with the compendium, because it explains it more. And I can add, of course, the Catechism of the Council of Trent. It's not as wordy and more clear, and the Catechism of St. Pius X, which is a question and answer catechism. I just love our catechism. There we go. If we receive it, not only with the lips, but with the heart, then through the formulas of faith, we will truly enter into communion with God. Because through faith, through correct faith, you will reach communion with God. And of course, because there is no other name under heaven by which we must be saved, except Jesus of Nazareth. Let's see here. Who will rise today to announce to the cities of the West the faith they expect? Who will rise to announce true faith to Muslims? They search for it without knowing it. Who will be the missionaries the world needs? Who will be the missionaries who will teach the integrity of the faith to so many Catholics who do not know what they believe? We can no longer call ourselves believers and live in practice as atheists. I believe we are at a turning point in the history of the church. Yes, the church needs reform, but that will start with the life of the priests. Of course, dear friends, Cardinal Sarah says, we are not called to be mediocre Christians. No, God calls us all to the total gift, to the martyrdom of the body, of the heart, or the heart. He calls us to holiness. Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And of course, he says the conclusion of his book deals with something he calls a liquid atheism. Basically going along with the world and not contradicting it. Living as atheists, even though we call ourselves Catholics. I want to invite all Christians to conversion. My dear friends, So this is his last paragraph. He says, we must create places where virtues can flourish. It's time to regain the courage to be anti-conformist. So we cannot be of the world. We can be in the world, but not of the world. We cannot conform because the society tells us this is politically correct. This is to standards of the day. What was considered perverse 20 years ago is now normal, and actually it's all right, and we have to conform to it. Otherwise we'd be shut down or imprisoned. We have to be anti-conformist. We have to have the courage of the anti-conformism. Christians must have the strength to form oases where the air is breathable, where simply the Christian life is possible. So it's good to have churches and people buying property and living close to these churches where the kids could go to the church school and the families, Christian families, could be friends together and visit each other. So one can breathe in this world of Antichrist. And this is his last paragraph. I'm going to read it in full. I call Christians to open oases of gratuity in the desert of triumphant profitability. Yes, you can remain alone. You cannot remain alone in the desert of society without God. A Christian who remains alone is a Christian in danger. It will end up being eaten by the sharks of the trading society. Christians must gather in communities around their cathedrals, the houses of God. We must create places where the air is breathable, or simply the Christian life is possible. Our communities must put God in the center. At the center of our lives, at the center of our thoughts, at the center of our actions, our liturgies, our cathedrals. In the avalanche of lies, we must be able to find places where the truth is not only explained but experienced. It is all about living the gospel, not to think of it as utopia, but to concretely experience it. Faith is like a fire. One must be our own self burning to be able to transmit it. And of course, the more embers together, the bigger the fire. That's why one person, one fire can be extinguished. Watch over this sacred fire. May it be your warmth in the heart of the winter of the West. When a fire lights up in the night, men gather around it. This is our hope. This is our cathedral. Cardinal Robert Sarah. Great, great, great man. I so hope that he will be the next pope. And if he is elected, he will face such opposition from the entrenched bureaucracy in the Vatican and bishops' conferences and all the rest. Anyways, so I thought this has not been reported or hardly ever reported anywhere on the internet or in the Catholic media, or even just bits and pieces. But this is the full article. I'll post the link. Watch it. Read every word. I skipped a whole lot, but it is very, very edifying. Let us pray for Cardinal Robert Sarah for long life and good health, an increase of faith, hope, and charity, that he will be a true light, a true shepherd, a true bishop. He is a true successor of the apostles, a man according to God's own heart. Anyways, this is it for today. And as soon as I'm done reading his book, that one, I'll do a full review of it. And as it stands, it looks fantastic.